So good afternoon and welcome to the University of St. Thomas and to our Schultz Grand Atrium. My name is Hank Shea. I'm a fellow here at the law school and also at the Holleran Center for Ethical Leadership in the Professions. Today I am honored to be able to introduce Mike Hurley as our speaker. As you all know, he'll be speaking to us on terrorism in America. What are the current threats, and is the United States government doing enough to defend us? We're here today because of the Holleran Center and largely efforts by St. Thomas law students who have worked for months to put this together. This is actually Mike Hurley's third presentation today. He had an 8 a.m. breakfast with one group of students, a noon lunch with another group of students, and this is the final presentation of the day. We are, as always, grateful to Medtronic for its ongoing support for this and many other similar type programs. Let me just briefly tell you that today started more than 30 years ago. I first met Mike Hurley about 32 years ago in Washington, D.C. He was training to be a CIA operative, about what you're going to hear. I was an Army lawyer at the Pentagon. And the reason we met is because of Janine Lee, who is also with us here today. Mike's good friend, went to the U of M together, and at the time, good friends with my wife, brought us together in D.C., and I recognized in Mike Hurley somebody who I wanted to stay in contact with for the rest of my life. And intermittently, I've been able to do that. He's not always the easiest guy to be in touch with because of his career, but we stayed in touch, and I will tell you that it is with pride, it's with admiration, and I think most importantly, it's with gratitude that I welcome him here to St. Thomas today. And let me just give you a few reasons why that's the case. Mike is a Minnesota native. He attended the University of Minnesota, both undergrad and for law school, but he was not destined to have the traditional career of a lawyer. After a short time in private practice, he was accepted by the CIA and became an operative for them for the bulk of his career. It took him around the world. It took him to places like Kosovo, Bosnia, Haiti. It took him to places like the National Security Council staff of the White House in Washington, D.C. After the 9/11 attacks, he walked upstairs to a different part of the CIA headquarters, and he asked first what he could do to help. Then he volunteered to switch jobs, to join the counterterrorism effort, and soon after that volunteered to go to Afghanistan, where he was asked to help lead the hunt for bin Laden. 3 separate tours in Afghanistan over the next 18 months. Maybe we'll be able to hear a little bit about that today, but he doesn't talk much about it. You will soon find out, I think, that is always ready to talk about other people's efforts, not as much his own. He came back to the States. He was asked to work on the 9/11 Commission as a director of counterterrorism policy, the one to see from the inside what we should have learned from those tragic events and what we could do differently in the future. He ended up writing large sections of the 9/11 Commission's report that became a national bestseller. Mike then continued his career of public service as a counterterrorism advisor assigned to the State Department. He then went on to become an advisor to Senator Ted Nunn and also Ted Turner as part of the nuclear threat initiative efforts in Washington, D.C. I'm going to skip his many awards except to mention one, the one I think that he has told me he is most proud of, and that was being elected into the Edina High School Hall of Fame. Mike finally retired from the CIA several years ago. He has formed his own consulting company. He works around the world. It's called Team 3I. He's working with foreign governments, companies, and other organizations. He fills his free time by going to events such as this and speaking to others about national security issues and counterterrorism policy. So Mike will speak for about 45 minutes and then take questions from the audience. If it's anything like what we've had earlier today, we hope there will be many questions. We'll get to as many as possible. The way we'll do it is please write them on a note card. Hopefully you got a note card on the way in. There's certainly some others over on the table, and students will collect them starting in about 15, 20 minutes. But we invite your questions. Mike got the full gamut earlier today, and I didn't hear single question not being answered. We invite you to continue the conversation for a brief reception after the program ends at 6:30. And other than that, I ask everybody to warmly welcome Mike Hurley.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm so happy to be here at the University of St. Thomas College School of Law. Thanks to the Holleran Center, to Professor Hank Shea. This is really a remarkable place. This is the first time I've been in the University of St. Thomas School of Law. And I think it's a fantastic, imposing structure, beautiful lines, beautiful architecturally. And one of the things I've learned as life has gone by is that, this kind of center of excellence does not come about randomly. It comes about through concerted effort from supporters, from deans, from faculty, from the student body, from staff. And this really is a center of excellence, and it's an honor to be here. It's also pretty nice to be standing in front of a statue of one of my heroes, Sir Thomas More, later St. Thomas More. And I remember some of my favorite lines in literature are from the play A Man for All Seasons by Robert Bolt, in which Sir Thomas More says, "The world must construe according to its wits. This court must construe according to the law." And those have always sort of stuck with me. And when I'm in a place like this, I often kind of think of great legal thinkers. And another, of course, great legal thinker and influence on our country was Chief Justice John Marshall in the early days of our country. And there's a story I've always kind of liked about Marshall. So one day, John Marshall and his fellow Supreme Court justices, having heard disturbing rumors about their own excessive drinking, jointly agreed to abstain on their weekly consultation day, unless it was raining. The following consultation day, Marshall, the Chief Justice, instructed Justice Joseph Story to go to the window and check for inclement weather. Justice Story soon reported back, "Mr. Chief Justice, I have very carefully examined this case," he declared, "and I have to give it as my considered opinion that there is not the slightest sign of rain." "Mr. Justice Story," Marshall replied, "I think that is the shallowest and most illogical opinion I've ever heard you deliver. You forget that our jurisdiction is as broad as the Republic, and by the laws of nature, it must be raining someplace in this grand country. Waiter, bring on the rum." One of my favorite anecdotes about Justice Marshall. So it's always a pleasure to be back here in Minneapolis. This is really a homecoming and a return for me. When I speak to a group about the threat of terrorism, I always do it on behalf of the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, Governor Tom Kean and Congressman Lee Hamilton. I told them that I was coming here, and they asked me to give the University of St. Thomas School of Law and all of you their regards. They really are remarkable leaders now in their early 80s, and I'm going to talk more about them and a little bit about the bipartisan nature of the 9/11 Commission towards the end of my remarks, because I think there's some real lessons for us today in a time of great political division. And these two are real heroes of mine. But I have to tell you that Minnesota and the Twin Cities hold a very warm place in their hearts, and it's for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is that the media here in Minnesota followed very, very closely the work of the 9/11 Commission and the aftermath and the last 10 years of terrorism and the threat and how it affects the U.S. And one of the people that has followed it so closely is Gary Eichten of Minnesota Public Radio, who is here. And Gary and his colleagues, his producer, Sarah Meyer, his other colleague at Minnesota Public Radio, Carrie Miller, really covered the story of the 9/11 attacks and what the 9/11 Commission did and what it recommended. I mean, they really devoted countless hours of airtime. And I know they did it as a public service to Minnesotans. And my impression, sort of watching this from my perch in Washington, was they covered it better than any other outlet or broadcasting medium in the United States. More recently, in the last few years, Dan Barrero of KFAN has also gotten into these issues, and he's done a great job, as has the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And I think it's really important to keep the public connected with what's been going on in the world, and they do a wonderful job. And that's why the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission are so partial to this area. So we're here to talk about the threat of terrorism to our homeland today, and how our government is doing. Well, just initially, I'd start off by saying that we've made a lot of progress since 9/11, and that our government, I think, has taken a number of measures that are protecting us pretty well. I've got some criticisms, and we'll get to those. But if we look at where we are today in 2014, 13 and a half years or 13 plus years after the 9/11 attacks, a lot of the things that our leaders most feared after those attacks have not occurred. We've had certainly some tragedies here and some sort of terrorist attacks. I'm thinking of the attacks, the shootings in Fort Hood by Major Hassan in 2009. A number of soldiers were killed there. The Boston Marathon bombings in spring 2013 as well, with the deaths there and so many wounded. These are tragedies, and they're very serious things. Every time we mourn, every time we lose a fellow American, and we have to always keep this in our mind. But what we haven't experienced is a massive catastrophe on the scale of a 9/11 type attack. And that's a good thing, because our leadership feared so much in the days after 9/11 that that's exactly what would happen. And they had good reason to think that. And I just want to review this just for a moment. You may remember that in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the anthrax scare here in the country, and maybe we're reminded of that because of the Ebola scare going on now, but people were very, very concerned about an anthrax attack launched by terrorists. But I think something that I saw very firsthand going on in government, our leaders were mostly concerned about a possible nuclear attack in the United States after the 9/11 attacks. And the reason for that was the US government actually had intelligence in the days after the 9/11 attacks that a nuclear weapon or device, a dirty bomb possibly, might have been, I say might have been, secreted somewhere in the United States. Now, at the time, there was the father of the Pakistani hydrogen bomb, a man named A.Q. Khan, who was sort of a rogue arms dealer, selling his secrets to North Korea, and our intelligence services knew that he had been in discussions with al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We didn't know the content of those discussions. We didn't know what they might have led to. We didn't know if technology had changed hands. But that is what the Bush administration in fall of 2001 was so deeply concerned about after those attacks. The president's job, first and foremost, is to take measures to keep the country secure. And this was on President George Bush's mind, and the Secretary of Defense, and all of our top leadership. And I can tell you that our agents all over the world were scouring the world to find any facts or details that might have shed light on that problem. So that's what everyone was concerned about. And I believe, and I told the students today in a couple of the discussions I had, that I think that drove so many of the decisions that the Bush administration made early on to respond to the terrorist threat and the al-Qaeda threat. And we can talk about some of that. But it was very serious. So that hasn't occurred. And I think a lot of experts today are not quite as worried about a nuclear threat here from terrorists for a lot of reasons. Because it's difficult to get your hands on nuclear materials, although we do get very concerned about the proliferation of this in some of the countries that have them. But it's a kind of complicated operation. And in talking to our leadership in Homeland Security now, they're more concerned about smaller type operations using conventional weapons rather than these sort of big, massive attacks. You can't rule it out because obviously the consequences, the gravity of the harm that would be caused to the country if something like a dirty bomb went off here somewhere would be so substantial and in fact would change our country in profound ways. So let me tell you about kind of the basis for some of the things I'm going to share with you. This past July was the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 Commission report. And the 9/11 Commission report, which was published in July 2004, profoundly changed our national security structure in this country. It made some very, very important changes that the government implemented and Congress passed into law. These were important changes, and what the 9/11 commissioners decided to do, the 9/11 Commission no longer exists legally, but the commissioners still get together because they still follow these issues. And about a year ago, in advance of the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 Commission report this past July, they decided to take a look at what the current threat was and to make a few recommendations to the government. They're not an official body, but they still have the power of persuasion, let's say, because they approached their work in the past in a bipartisan way. So they wanted to look at what the current threat is today, and I was involved in that work. And I have to say it was a task that I probably won't take on again in the future on the 20th anniversary, because the commissioners are all very bright, but they're 10 years older, they're 10 years further away from the issues, and getting them to agree in the unanimous way that they did for the 9/11 Commission report was kind of a difficult task. But one of the things that we did to inform them of what's currently going on is we decided to hold discussions with some of the senior-most leaders in national security in the United States, currently sitting in their jobs today, but also some ones that are what I call recent former leaders as well, too. And so we talked to a group of 20 to 24 of our top leaders. And what emerged from those discussions is what you're about to hear. These were unclassified discussions. The commissioners don't have security, most of them don't have security clearances anymore. And, but they were very, very candid. And we talked to people like General Jim Clapper, who was the Director of National Intelligence. We talked to former Secretaries of Homeland Security like Michael Chertoff and Tom Ridge, and the current Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson. We talked to Leon Panetta, who's a former Secretary of Defense and Director of CIA. We talked to Mike Leiter, who was Director of the National Counterterrorist Center, a former one, and then the current Director, Matt Olson. We talked to General Keith Alexander, who was the Director of the National Security Agency, so much in the news because of electronic eavesdropping. He's a four-star general. We talked to John Brennan, who's the current Director of CIA. Sort of a whole range of interesting people, including Jim Comey, who's the current director of the FBI, and Bob Mueller, who was director of the FBI for 10 years and left his position about a year ago. And what came from these discussions was, I think, remarkable unanimity among these leaders about what the current threats are that are facing the country. And that's what I want to kind of go into to right now. So it will come as no surprise that one of the biggest threats now is what you see in the headlines every day in the papers, and that is the rise of what's now called the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. It's gone by a couple of other names. It's been known by its acronym ISIS and ISIL, but most people call it simply the Islamic State now. And this is a group of extremists sort of on jihad in Syria and in Iraq who are so brutal in their actions that, if you can imagine this, Al-Qaeda itself ejected them from their organization. That's pretty hardcore. This is the group that has been beheading some of the journalists that it's captured, both British and American, and it just commits brutal tactics all the time. So what are its goals? The goal of this organization is really to set up a caliphate, an Islamic State under Sharia law in Syria and Iraq. That's what they're trying to do, and eventually take over as much of the Middle East as they possibly can. Because having done that, their eyes are going to be on the holy places to Islam, Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, and you can bet your bottom dollar the Saudis are very, very worried about what they may be doing. So is this group a threat to the United States? President Obama, a couple of weeks ago, told us very explicitly that it is. And that's why he's authorized U.S. airstrikes. Remember, we've pulled our ground troops out of Iraq after so many years in that conflict. But as this radical group has gained power, our policymakers believe that intervening at this point and using airstrikes to interdict their growth and sort of drive them back and defeat them is important to our national security. Now, they certainly threaten in that region. They've also lately, in part in response to U.S. military actions and these airstrikes, they've threatened our homeland. And what's very interesting in terms of other developments in our news, and again, you can look at the newspapers every day in terms of what's happening, is sort of what's been going on here. Now, there's not a direct link, like centralized command and control, to some of the recent events in the United States in terms of the Islamic State having ordered them, but there is kind of a connection. We've had this terrible event in New York City a week ago of a person influenced online by extremists, and he took a hatchet to 4 policemen in New York City. There was the attack in Ottawa on the Canadian Parliament by a Muslim man also influenced to jihad, who killed a soldier there. Another motorist ran down another soldier in Canada. Just a few weeks ago, there was a terrible incident in Oklahoma where a worker who had been trying to convert some of his co-workers at a food processing plant there beheaded a co-worker. Now, some of these people are just simply deranged, but some of them are very much influenced by what they're learning in these sort of chat rooms that terrorists and Islamic State like to use. Earlier this summer in Brussels, there was a French national, but with a Muslim and an ethnic North African background, whose last name was Nemouche, and he had been in Syria. He had been working with the Islamic State there. He was a jailer, not a very impressive guy, kind of a loser and a criminal. There were some Americans held in the jail that he ran. He tortured them. When he went back to France, he took a bus up to Brussels, walked into a Jewish museum in Brussels with an AK-47, a Kalashnikov, and randomly killed 4 people at the museum, and then hightailed it back to France where he got caught. But just another person sort of influenced by the call to jihad that the Islamic State is sort of urging. Recently, in the headlines, I think just yesterday, we learned, and I think Washington's known this for a while, that the Islamic State forces in Syria and Iraq have acquired a number of what are called manpads. They're shoulder-launched missiles, and they're capable within range of shooting down commercial airliners and certainly military transports. If they get close to Baghdad and the Baghdad airport, the U.S. government and our allies are going to have to totally reroute our sort of air access in and out there, because those planes and the people on them are going to be in serious risk. Now, one of the things that I'm very, very concerned about is that there's increasing indications of Western women in the West, who are being attracted to go and be connected with the Islamic State. That's very troubling. There have been women sort of jihadists before, and incidents in Europe and some in the United States. There was someone who was known as Jihad Jane. I think she was in the East Coast somewhere, this is 5 or 6 years ago, who went to Scandinavia to commit some, homicide against someone who had published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and thereby defiled, was the view, Islam. And she was caught before she could do that. So this has occurred in the past, but now there's increasing evidence of this. And we see some American women as well who are traveling to Syria, 1, to join the fight, and 2, to marry these Islamic fighters. They've been so sort of seduced and attracted by the rhetoric that's taking place over the internet to join these groups and to attack the United States. Now, one of the really deep concerns that came out of our conversations with our leaders is the following. There have been so many foreign fighters from other countries that have gone to Syria to join these militant groups there and these extremist groups. Our authorities, our intelligence authorities, believe somewhere between 100 and 150 Americans have gone to Syria to join these fights. That's really troubling. Thousands of Europeans, probably more than 2,000, have gone as well. A total of 12 to 15,000 foreign fighters have gone to Syria. This is really deeply troubling. Why? Because the question is, what happens to them while they're there? How much indoctrination do they get? What battlefield tactical skills do they develop in terms of being able to use explosive devices and small arms and so on? And then, most importantly, what are they going to do when the fighting is over or when they come back, and where are they going to go back to? They're going to go back to their home countries with these skills and this indoctrination. And this is a huge, huge concern to our government officials to try to get their arms around this problem. Because some of them probably are receiving orders from the hierarchies of Islamic State while they're in Syria and kind of under their control. Now, and it's not just a problem of the 100 to 150 Americans that are over there, it's all the Europeans as well, too. Why? Because they come from countries, allied countries, that participate in what the State Department calls the visa waiver program. These are countries that are so friendly to the United States that we don't require visas for them to travel into our country. That means England, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, these countries basically where we think people are just coming for holidays or whatever, and that they won't stay and burden our welfare system and whatever, and they'll go back home. So they're able to pass through our customs and immigration control, passport control with minimal scrutiny, basically. And that's just how it is. So we're going to have to rethink that system, because there's literally thousands of these people that are from those countries that will be able to enter the United States. Now, we have certain advantages in this, and one advantage is our sharing of information amongst our intelligence agencies and our allied intelligence agencies. One interesting thing about a lot of these people is that they're young. And what do young people do? Young people use their cell phones, they use Facebook, they use Twitter, and the jihadists are no different. They take photos of themselves with people that they've killed, and they post them on Facebook and whatever, or they do their tweets, and they say where they are. And so meanwhile, and we'll get into this subject, the National Security Agency, which has come under a lot of criticism, is sucking up a lot of this information, and that's really, through those technical means, how we're able to get our arms around who they may be and maybe be able to stop them or question them, pull them into secondary screening when they try to re-enter the United States. But that is not a perfect system. Some of them will be able to get through. We don't have information on every single one of them. But that is a pretty effective way to stay on top of them. Now, talking about the problem of more women joining this cause, I used to give talks and I would say this is terrorists mostly are recruiting young men. The profile is 16 to 35 maybe. That's, if the FBI profiles these people, that's generally what they are. Sex, male, age, that's the demographic. When you add women to this, it just opens up a whole new, sort of possible can of nightmares. And to drive this point home, I read in the paper, and you may have as well too, a little over a week ago, 3 teenage girls from the suburbs of Denver were arrested by authorities because they were on their way to Syria to join the fight with the extremists. 3 teenage girls who their parents basically thought they were, sort of just normal teenagers, essentially. They had no idea. And some of them took money from their parents. Some of them got money in other ways to buy the tickets to go. And my assumption, although I don't know for sure, is they were on certain websites that the FBI and law enforcement follow pretty closely. And my guess is that's how they knew who they were and when they were going to travel and to arrest them. But think about this. We have populations mostly of young people, and we know this here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I mean, let's be frank about it, because of the Somali community, about 30,000 in Minnesota, and it's been a problem for them. In the past, some of the young people have become disaffected, and they've traveled to the Middle East, particularly to join the Al-Shabaab organization in Somalia. They want to join in the fight, and we can talk about some of the reasons for this. But that kind of recruitment that's taking place, and a lot of it is taking place online, is really difficult, really difficult for law enforcement to deal with. Because in this country, you don't arrest people for how they think or for even what they say, unless there's certain rules where you can, if they're inciting people to violence. But in general, you can't arrest somebody until they commit a criminal act. But by that time, the problem here is they're already too far along in the sort of recruitment phase towards radicalism. So how do you get your arms around that problem to deal with it, in a way where you're not violating their rights, but you're also preventing them from making a very, very serious mistake that's going to ruin their lives potentially. And in many cases, as I said, who sees these changes in people as they become more radicalized when they're 16, 17, or 18? It really has to be the parents or the brothers and sisters or the close friends that remark on these kinds of changes, or religious leaders or teachers. And we kind of need here strategies, I think, for doing what I call inoculating these communities in advance. Our social workers, state and local workers, need to kind of be aware of these things and have open dialogue with the communities most at risk. Again, not to violate their rights, but to work hand in hand with them to kind of stop the problem and to get our arms around it, because it's increasingly a problem. And I really think that this latest example of these young girls, and ask yourself, well, why do you want to go and join these organizations? I think there's a romantic notion for people that may be disaffected, may be somewhat alienated, frustrated, may have a sense that they're powerless, that they're outsiders in our communities. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that you can posit. And they're told by these very clever, manipulative people who are trying to recruit them over the internet, in blogs and on chat rooms, that if you come, you'll be part of a great enterprise. You'll change the world. You'll advance your religion. Your life will change. And these are really powerful influences on young people in particular, especially if they have a sense that they have meaningless lives. If you offer them something meaningful, they tend to kind of move in that direction. And I think that's one of the things very much that we're facing. And so what does it mean here at home? As I said, the problem of these folks coming back, it's a very, very serious problem. I think, and I think a lot of our leaders in Homeland Security believe that what we're likely to see here is not the big attacks, but more type attacks like the Boston Marathon bombings, or somebody with a machine gun who goes into a public place, a sporting event, a subway station, a bus station, a railway station, something like that. Something like we're seeing, occasionally in Europe now. Let's face it, it's not hard to get your hands on handguns here and weapons. And to do something like that, that's what they're concerned about. They're really concerned about someone who gets a backpack and puts explosives in it and has bought all of this sort of propaganda and is willing to sacrifice themselves for this cause, because they believe it will be a fulfilling kind of action. And that's what our leadership is really concerned about, more than a nuclear attack. But when you think about it, these kind of smaller attacks can do an awful lot of damage. It wouldn't be existential damage, but they could certainly, hurt a dozen people, kill a dozen people, or 20 people. And that's what we're deeply concerned about with these folks that are coming back. So that's the foreign fighter problem. There's another very big problem out there, and I'll be very frank and open, and this was on every senior leader's mind that we spoke with. There's a man in Yemen, he's probably the most wanted terrorist in the world, or among them. His name is Ibrahim al-Asiri. He's Saudi or Yemeni, something, maybe a cross between the two. And he is kind of the expert bomb maker for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. He is the person that designed the famous underwear bomb for the young man that was on the Northwest flight, then I think it was still Northwest, in 2009 over Detroit, that tried to detonate a bomb on a plane with 150 people on it or so. And he was incompetent and failed to do it. But that was a very close call. When I say that we haven't experienced a 9/11 scale attack here, we haven't. But we've had some very, very close calls like that one, which is very, very serious and narrowly avoided. So he also designed a bomb for a suicide bomber that strapped essentially the same undergarment to himself and got close to a member of the Saudi royal family and blew him up about 2 or 3 years ago. Now, what Ibrahim al-Asiri is trying to do is he's educating another whole group of younger jihadis in bomb making. And they're getting practical experience in Syria and Iraq these days at that skill. And what they're doing is they're getting better at miniaturization of bombs, concealment of bombs, and this is really a tough one for us, making bombs using non-metallic substances, which makes them very, very difficult to detect by our conventional airport sort of detection mechanisms that we all go through. So what does this mean? Well, one thing, if you remember from the papers this summer and you traveled, the Transportation Security Administration imposed new rules, and people for a while at least had to start turning on their cell phones and turning on their computers again. I remember we used to do that, their laptops, 15 or 20 years ago, but to turn them on to show that they were actually working and not sort of dummy type explosive devices. That was a direct result of intelligence that the government obtained about these new worrisome sorts of weapons. And to be very direct with you, a couple of our senior-most officials told us, as we were getting the information for the paper that we wrote, that they told us that one in particular said, I wake up every morning thinking I'm going to read a headline that a commercial airliner or 2 or 3 has blown up in the sky over the United States or transatlantic or trans-Pacific. And they literally sort of think, and when that happens, they say it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. It really likely won't be due to an intelligence failure, might possibly, but it's going to be because the adversary wakes up every morning trying to determine how to do this and how to attack us, and using precisely that kind of a weapon. So that's a huge concern now in terms of the threats that we face. Another one is, and this is a little bit off the terrorism topic, but it's related. From every senior official that we spoke to, we learned that the threat to our cyber systems is one of the most important threats that we face today as a country. Our society, our economy is so dependent on the internet. The internet has produced so much good for us, but it can be used by bad people and it can be used to hurt us as well. And there's these two aspects in terms of our cyber vulnerability. One is to our critical infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Our dams, our water supply, our electrical grids, our telecommunications, our banking, all these things that we depend on so much, our finances. That's one part of it. And there are countries out there, adversary countries, which have capabilities to disrupt that critical infrastructure. It's rather interesting. This wasn't a cyber attack. On the same day as the Boston Marathon bombings, 2,500 miles away in California, in Metcalf, California, which is close to Silicon Valley, a group, an individual, some people tried to wipe out, basically shut down the power grid for Silicon Valley. And they basically did it with high-powered rifles. And the FBI investigated this. So power was only shut down for a short time, but it was an actual attack on an electrical substation. And they knew which substation to attack that was a critical switching node or something for the electrical system. This, the FBI concluded, was not a case of Billy Bob or Jimmy Ray having had a couple of brewskis going out with a rifle and let's shoot up a substation. This was a serious attack on our electrical grid. The FBI still doesn't know who was behind it. But attacks on our critical infrastructure are very, very serious. They're a serious threat that we face today. But back to cyber for a moment. So we have this critical infrastructure. And a chilling thing for me was we spoke to former Secretary of Defense and Director of CIA, Leon Panetta. And we kind of asked him, like, well, what are the capabilities of the Chinese, for example, and sort of potential adversary states? And he said, that's classified information and I can't tell you. But what I will tell you as a former director of CIA and Secretary of Defense, I know exactly what capabilities we have to take down systems of our adversaries, and they're awesome. And people can't even begin to understand what we can do to an adversary. And he said, I can only assume that the Chinese have a similar capability to do something similar to us, which I thought was a pretty scary thought. So there's that whole vulnerability of our national sort of defense systems and critical infrastructure. There's also the stealing of defense secrets that's going on using cyber systems. The Chinese have gained huge advantages by stealing over the internet plans for our F-35 Joint Fight Striker. It's an advanced system, defense system. The Global Hawk surveillance platform that can stay up in the air forever. It's a drone. It's a very important drone system that we have. They've shaved from 20 to 25 years off the research they otherwise would have had to do by getting this kind of information over the internet. The Department of Defense, the US Navy, the US Army, all our military services are getting attacked millions of times each day by cyber attacks. Now, you all know here on the commercial side, because of the attacks on Target, for example, and kind of the loss of all the debit and credit card information and all that, you know how serious it is on the commercial side. This is happening on the defense side as well. One person sort of described also the stealing of intellectual property that corporations have, American corporations. And this came from General Keith Alexander, who was the former director of the National Security Agency until about 5 months ago, a 4-star general. He said that what the Chinese are taking from us amounts to the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. Imagine that. Now, we talked to the director of CIA who sort of said, look, as a society, we have to come to grips with this now and come up with new ways to deal with this. Our defenses, our cyber defenses, are lagging way behind the offensive capabilities that can be used against us. And the director of CIA essentially said he believes the way we need to think about this is, look, in the physical world, we have cops on the street corners, we have patrol cars, we like them going into our neighborhoods to sort of be present. Bad guys know that the police are kind of watching the area. And there's a degree to this that we're happy with, sort of accepting as a society. The digital world needs policing. in the same way, in a way. Now, we have to come to grips with that. We like our privacy in terms of our messaging and so on and so forth. But if that system can be used against us, you have to kind of strike a balance eventually. And we'll need some kind of policing, some sort of protocol, something we can agree on as a country, as Americans, that will defend us and allow us to use these systems and not have them used against us. And I thought that was a pretty good kind of framework, a way to look at all of this. So those, I think, are some of the key threats against us that we're facing today. And so let me say a word about how at least I think our government is doing in terms of defending us. One of the big weaknesses we had pre-9/11 as a country was our agencies, unfortunately, didn't share information very well. And we ask ourselves, well, that's crazy. I mean, they're part of the United States government. Taxpayers sort of expect that the government will be able to share information. Well, yes, but the fact is that each agency, as many of the lawyers here know, and people, that judges and prosecutors and so on, know that each department had its own set of rules and protocols and regulations that it had to follow. The FBI, in conducting an investigation, can't share information with CIA about that investigation, for example. That's certainly the way it used to be. That would compromise a case that the government was bringing in court if things like that were to happen. CIA couldn't share certain information. We couldn't collect on US citizens, for example. And there are still all kinds of rules that govern that kind of information collection. So there were seams in our defenses pre-9/11. And a lot of the system had evolved during the Cold War, and we hadn't gotten around to changing that system fast enough to protect our country. So we're much, much better today at that kind of information sharing. The federal government also did not share information very well, didn't share information very well across the federal government, but it didn't share information very well down through state and local authorities as well. Basically, the view is we're the federal government, we'll tell you what you need to know, basically. That's what it was. And that was a real weakness for us because the country has something like 19,000 law enforcement agencies, and that's a lot of eyes and ears and experience that can be used to protect the country. Now, you don't have to share nuclear secrets with the cop on the beat in Stillwater, Minnesota, but you might want to call on that experience if that cop sort of sees something out of the ordinary and have two-way communication going. So we're much better at that. We're much better at sharing information with our allies as well, I think. One of the institutions that was created post 9/11, the National Counterterrorist Center, ensures that information is shared, and that's pretty good. We had 17 intelligence agencies in the United States government, and each of them had kind of their own boss. And that sort of worked during the Cold War. Doesn't work when you have a real agile enemy that you have to deal with. And so the government created the Director of National Intelligence, sort of one person that's in charge of the whole system, the budgets, deciding where priorities ought to be. And I have to say, I was unsure whether this would work when it was passed into law by Congress in late 2004. But we have a Director of National Intelligence now, General Jim Clapper, a four-star general, who everybody said that we spoke to is sort of doing it right. And you rarely hear that from Washington national security sort of leaders. They'll never say that about a colleague, but they all did about him. And to me, that was pretty reassuring. He's a guy, I think he's late 60s or early 70s, and has a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience. And he's doing a good job. I want to say a word, too, because you've all read so much in the press, over the last couple years, but particularly since Edward Snowden disclosed so many government classified documents about the National Security Agency's collection program, electronic surveillance, and so on. So I want to say a word about it. And I'm really not stating preferences here. I'm just making observations. But it's interesting because the 9/11 commissioners, as we did this project this past year, looked at this very, very closely. We had a lot of really sort of, couple of the members of the 9/11 Commission are, sort of people that associate very strongly with the American Civil Liberties Union. They take privacy and civil liberties very, very seriously. Really all of them did, Republican and Democrat, I'd have to say. And a lot of them going into this project thought, okay, when we look at that, at what NSA is doing, we're going to think that we're going to be very critical. We're going to say it's a tremendous overreach in terms of what they're collecting. But let me tell you what happened. So we learned from our leadership about what the National Security Agency is actually doing in light of, the press has reported from the Snowden leaks, as I said. And the interesting thing is that, that in considering what the government is actually doing and what they're collecting, the big thing is one program, it's bulk collection of what's called metadata. And just to tell you what metadata is, many of you probably know, some may not. What is metadata? Well, the NSA is not listening to the content of conversations of Americans. It can't do that without a warrant. But what it can do is it can collect information on numbers that are called and times of day that are called. Now, why can it do that legally? It can do that legally because of the US Patriot Act that was passed post 9/11, especially Section 215, which gives the NSA authority to do that. And it's been challenged in the courts as unconstitutional, amounting to an illegal search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. But, and it's actually pretty interesting, because there's Supreme Court case law going back to 1979, so 35 years, Smith versus Maryland. And I won't go into all the details of this case, but essentially it involved a phone company that was asked to give calling records, not content of conversation, but calling records, numbers called by a particular phone number of someone that the police suspected to be a drug dealer, basically. All right. So when this drug dealer was convicted on the basis of evidence collected by the police from the telephone company, he brought an action, and he claimed that his rights were violated under the Fourth Amendment, and that evidence obtained had to be excluded from the trial that he was in. And so it went through appellate court, district court, appellate court, and it got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court held in this case that that person did not have a reasonable expectation of privacy about what numbers he was calling. Well, why didn't he? Well, because he already knew that a third party, i.e. the telephone company, had that information, and they could give it to the police as a result. So it was unreasonable for him to believe that that was private information. And essentially today, that is the legal foundation under sort of Supreme Court, US Supreme Court precedent that supports the bulk metadata collection of billions of numbers called, essentially. Now, there are district courts now where this is being challenged, and it's interesting because a couple of different judges have written strong opinions coming down differently on whether this is legal. And what's interesting to me is, I think the two most well-known cases now involve one judge, and I'll get this wrong, I can't remember off the top of my head, but one judge is a George W. Bush appointee, and the other is a Bill Clinton appointee. And it's the George W. Bush appointee that basically ruled that this is a almost Orwellian overreach of government, sort of power and authority, whereas the Clinton appointee basically said, hey, this is okay, which is sort of interesting and a bit counterintuitive. But we're getting kind of these differing decisions from US district courts, and probably it's going to have to be resolved by the Supreme Court. The American Civil Liberties Union, for example, takes a strong case and says, look, this case, this precedent is 35 years old. Technology has changed since then. We kind of need new Supreme Court doctrine. And, we'll see if the Supreme Court kind of heads in that direction. I don't know the answer to that. But that is the basis for this. Now, what I want to share with you, so NSA is lawfully allowed to collect who you're calling, or the number, the numbers that you're calling, what time of day, and so on, because you don't have an expectation of privacy to that information. So why do they need that information? Well, basically it comes down to how they're collecting information from terrorists. When we capture a terrorist, they have computers, they have cell phones, they have all the kind of media that they've been using. And the fact is that they have, some may have been calling people in the United States, possibly making bank transactions, making travel transactions, all those kinds of things. So the only way you can tell if they're in touch with people in the US or elsewhere around the world is if your pool of data, of numbers called, is sufficiently big so you can run it against that. That's why they're doing it. That's why they're doing it. And what they'll say, our authorities will say, is one, there are very tight controls over this. Congress is watching it very closely. There's a lot of oversight. And we're not violating rights of Americans. And moreover, it's protected us. And they'll cite a number of sort of cases. Now, I think what happened with the commissioners is they listened to this and they heard these 25 leaders, all of whom said, this is essential for protecting our safety in the country, kind of continuing with these programs. And the commissioners believed that if the American people, the public, and I think the press has done a pretty poor job about reporting what's actually going on, they tend to be sensationalistic about this. They don't describe the actual oversight or any of the rules kind of controlling who gets to see what. And the fact that really the content of conversations, the government's not taping the content of your conversations and all that kind of stuff. I think the 9/11 commissioners came to the conclusion that really the American people probably would support this as a necessary measure. This is just their opinion. Others may disagree about this, but that was kind of their consensus view, which I think is interesting. Now, one thing I want to talk about is one real failure in terms of, I think, where the government is failing all of us in terms of protecting us. And this is just a little bit Washington inside baseball kind of stuff, but I do think it's interesting. One of the 9/11 Commission's most important recommendations it made for reforming the government, it made a lot of recommendations for the executive branch, things that can do, and we've made a lot of changes. We've hardened our defenses, all these different things. But it also called on Congress to reform itself. So what does that mean? Well, it means a number of things. And when the 9/11 Commission report came out in 2004, commissioners acknowledged in writing this that that particular reform and recommendation would be the hardest one to implement because they understood Congress. And for 10 years after the 9/11 Commission recommendations came out, 41 recommendations, most of which have been passed into law and actually implemented, this one about congressional reform has not advanced 1 inch. And what is it? Well, here's an example. The Department of Homeland Security reports, and we could never get the figure right, but somewhere between 94 and 118 committees and subcommittees of Congress. That's who they report to. Each one of those committees and subcommittees claims some tiny bit of jurisdiction, some more than others, over the Department of Homeland Security. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means if you're the Secretary of Homeland Security, one of the top, obviously, national security and Homeland Security officials in the United States, you're reporting to 118 bosses. I have enough trouble reporting to one boss. Think about 118 bosses and the differing instructions and guidance that you get. So that oversight becomes highly, highly fragmented with a new, only 10 years old and young agency that's still struggling to find its way to do the things it needs to do to protect us. And it has this fragmented and balkanized oversight. So it's getting this. The Secretary of Homeland Security spends probably 50 to 60% of his time on Capitol Hill testifying to these various committees. If you draw the diagram, and the New York Times did this, the wiring diagram of who the Department of Homeland Security reports to, it looks like an absolute mess of spaghetti thrown against the wall. And I think there's a problem that's even worse than that in terms of it's not just the duplication of effort, the time spent testifying. It's the fact that we actually want our Congress, to be protecting us and to be guiding these agencies. That's a role of Congress, it's oversight. They should be helping these agencies do their jobs better. Well, if you're getting advice from one committee chairman, that's fine. If you're getting it from 118 that don't know the advice that the other ones have even offered, it's a recipe for disaster. And this actually creates a huge national security problem. Congress has refused to reform itself to reduce the number of committees overseeing some of these agencies. And the reason really is, well, it's the classic one. When you get into Congress and the Senate or the House of Representatives, you want to become the chairman of a committee. You want jurisdiction. You get cars and limousines assigned to you for your use. You get the best offices. I mean, I'm kind of trivializing this, but there is that aspect. You like the authority you have, and none of them ever, ever, ever want to give up the slightest iota of power that they have in their committees. So they're absolutely resisting this. And we've had people like Tom Ridge, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, former governor of Pennsylvania, who was also, I think, a congressman, who was passionate on this subject. And he just basically sort of says, if we don't get this solved, and it's a huge problem, not just in Homeland Security, but also in all the other areas. We haven't streamlined Congress for decades, basically, and it's a huge problem for us. So we're really, really falling down in that area, and we have to do better, but Congress sort of has to do that. So let me just say a few closing words here. I wanted to get back to the 9/11 Commission, and I told you, just to tell you a little bit about the leadership. So Governor Tom Kean and Congressman Lee Hamilton of Indiana, Lee Hamilton is a very plain-spoken, moderate Democrat, and Tom Kean is a moderate Republican. They're old school. Tom Kean was a Republican governor of New Jersey, a Democratic state. He was elected twice and is still considered the most popular governor and effective governor, I think, at least in New Jersey history in the 20th century. And they were models of bipartisanship as we did our work on the 9/11 Commission. There were 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, and they were people that had spent their lives in politics. I mean, they vehemently, deeply believed in their convictions if they were a Democrat or a Republican. And they had preformed, preconceived ideas when we began investigating the failures of our government that led to 9/11 or played a role in it. And Kean and Hamilton set a very bipartisan tone in all kinds of things they did. I could tell you a lot of stories about it, but it was really impressive the way they managed their colleagues on the 9/11 Commission. And to me, it was remarkable watching this demonstration of bipartisanship. It used to be, people that are my generation and older here will remember when politics stopped at the water's edge in this country. Some of the great accomplishments of this country following World War II, rebuilding Germany, rebuilding Europe after World War II, rebuilding Japan, the formation of the NATO alliance, some of these, the Marshall Plan, some of these massive programs that only the United States could do was done by bipartisanship. It couldn't have been done otherwise. The leaders of these parties, the 2 parties, got together and had vision, and they worked things out. Now, in my view, it's kind of lacking today in Washington. And it seems to me that terrorism is an area where we should be, bipartisanship should be sort of the name of the game. I'll share one experience I had, which I still consider one of the most poignant experiences I've had in my life. And it was on the day in July 2004 when the commissioners took the final vote on the 9/11 Commission as to whether to publish it or not publish it. This is after 18 months of work. And I was in the room. I was kind of a backbencher. I was one of 3 or 4 non-commissioners who were in that room. And I remember thinking at the time how lucky I was to be there to witness this. Because I sort of saw myself as a representative of, I guess, my family and my state and my country, just sort of an ordinary guy being in there, watching what was occurring. And I thought at the time about my dad. My dad was in the US Navy in World War II. He wasn't deployed overseas. The war ended before that happened. And one of the things I thought at the time was, having worked on the commission and conducted one part of its investigation, that, well, at least my dad wouldn't think that my law school education was a complete waste, basically. But that was one thing. The other thing that I thought at the time was how great it was to be living in a country that is able to hold its leadership accountable for their actions. Because it doesn't happen in very many other countries in the world. It's really a remarkable thing, and a thing that sets us apart. When I, as a 9/11 Commission member, sat across from former President Bill Clinton and asked him to explain the actions he took in response to al-Qaeda during his administration, and he had to answer. He had to answer me. When others posed the same questions to President Bush. In the end, our leaders are responsible and accountable to the people. And so there came this moment when the co-chairs asked the commissioners to vote on the final report. Now, there'd been fights all along and lots of editing. Okay, now it's time, right? The money's on the line here. This is going to be released. It's going to be given to the President and Congress 5 days from now. Yes or no, yay or nay, where are you on it? And then to see these highly partisan people, all 10 of them, say, yes, I support it. And this was a 567-page document, and they agreed on every word in it, and there was not one single dissent that was tacked onto it. I guess my point is, we're able to do this as a country and face these kinds of challenges. And I think, given the threats that we face as a country, it's time to see more of this kind of leadership in the country, and I really hope we're moving in that direction. I'd just like to conclude by thinking about the people who are overseas protecting us. We really ask much of those with the responsibility to protect us. Thousands of people whose names will never, ever be in the headlines have risen to the occasion and kept the United States safe over the last dozen years or so. Facing danger with courage, American military personnel, intelligence officers, diplomats, they're doing hard things in hard places. I can tell you right now as we speak, there's 18 and 19-year-olds out in some of the most desolate and forlorn places in the world facing great peril. Police, firefighters, Homeland Security officials, and other first responders keep Americans safe here at home. For all of these public servants, every day feels as urgent as the day after 9/11. Far too many of them have given their lives protecting their country and their fellow citizens. All of them have my profound admiration and gratitude. Thank you so much for coming here today.
As I maneuver around the chair. Reminder to people, if you have a question, please put it on a note card, and students are still gathering them. They've brought a number of them up. And Mike, I think what we'll do in the interest of time is to combine several of these questions together. So this is sort of a two-part question to start. General part, then a more specific part. Will the war on terror ever end? And if you had $100 million or more to spend to improve this nation's security, where would you spend those funds and why?
Good question. I think it will end, but I should share with you one of the things we heard from a former very high-level official of CIA. He said that that his grandchildren will be involved in dealing with the terrorist threat that we face. We described it in the 9/11 Commission report as a generational struggle, a twilight war, but I think it's a multi-generational struggle. I think eventually, I really think fundamentally what we're seeing is a struggle going on in the Islamic world among Sunni and Shia and vying for control, the breakdown still, the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire still. These things are playing out. It's kind of like the modern version of the wars of religion in Europe in the 17th century. And these forces are going to have to burn themselves out eventually. It's hard to put a timetable on that. But so I do think it will end, but it's not going to end anytime soon. And we'll be facing, I think, the dangers. $100 million, well, I guess as the boxer Mike Tyson would say, that's chump change for the US government. I'm not sure what you can get with $100 million. I'm kind of joking. You know what I would do? So we made a recommendation in this paper this past summer on the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 Commission report about creating a national cyber center. I mean, look, it's pretty interesting. Every senior official in the United States government thinks that we're going to undergo a massive cyber attack, right? One of the ways we analyzed 9/11 was kind of looking at that and say, you ask yourself the question, what do we wish we had done before the 9/11 attacks, you know, to have prevented them potentially? So everyone's telling us we're going to have a massive cyber Pearl Harbor or 9/11 facing us. That's what they're all saying. How about having a commission before that happens to us? Or setting up a national cyber center like the National Counterterrorism Center to ensure that we're doing everything possible to deal with the threat that they all say is coming. So I think I'd throw the $100 million at that, or maybe a chunk of it. And then I think another thing that the government really needs to do now, we've got to figure out a way to bring in the best technical brains that are out there, the engineers and so on that know how to deal with that issue, like really, really bright people. And they're not going to come in, or they can't really come in if they're being paid $500,000 or $250,000 in Silicon Valley to take a government job for $65,000 or $70,000. So I think I'd figure out, Congress can do whatever it wants. You can figure out ways to sort of say, we need you, 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 and you. And, you know, we're going to sweeten the pot a little bit. I think I might use it for that.
There's a series of questions about the Islamic State. I'll try and condense them together. The first is, how did the Islamic State grow so large and gain such deep pockets so quickly without our government's knowledge or preparation? And a follow-on is, what specific actions do you think should be taken from either an economic standpoint or a diplomatic standpoint in addition to these airstrikes to try and combat the growth of the Islamic State?
Well, I do think, I mean, I don't believe the line the administration put out and what I've seen in the press that CIA was surprised by the growth of the Islamic State. I don't believe that. I think they were reporting on it. I think a decision was made that we were going to withdraw our forces from Iraq. It's not really my thing to sort of criticize that, but there are certain consequences that happen. And we left this guy, al-Maliki, in charge in Iraq, and he didn't integrate the Shia. You got a huge battle going on there between the Shia majority and the Sunnis who've been displaced from power. And, you know, the politics there are so different than here. The sense isn't, you know, the great Minnesotan Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times and is from St. Louis Park, I think he's really good on these issues. He really studies the Middle East. And, you know, I mean, you look at this, you can't, if you displace one side from power and, you know, the other side sort of gets the shaft, it's not like, you know, here where you sort of say, okay, we lost this election, we'll go out and win the next one, we'll work hard. It's like, we lost this election, or we lost power, we're afraid for our lives, basically, because we're not a member of the clan, the tribe, whatever, that has the power and control. So
that then attracted, I think, people to join this cause. They wanted to get power back, and so, the Sunnis, this is the way they sort of strike back. So I think it accounts for that. How did they get the money? Well, they overran banks where there were billions of US dollars that we had given Iraq in these banks, and suddenly they're fixed with billions of dollars, essentially. And they have donors as well, too. So that's the first part of the question. The second part.
Do you think that economic sanctions, further diplomatic efforts can be used to combat the growth of the Islamic State, or should the main focus be on the airstrikes and supporting those who are battling those groups?
I don't think economic sanctions will work at all, but I also believe that, this is just going to be a reality based, at least on what I think. You can't stop them with airstrikes alone. You just can't. I mean, you're just not going to be able to. It's not going to happen. We probably have to define, how serious is this threat? I think it's pretty serious. The president seems to be taking it seriously. His administration does. But I see every day that he's got, his generals out on TV sort of saying, no, we're going to do this with airstrikes, but sorry, it's BS. They're not going to be able to do it, and to deal with this, you're going to have to go in there and do some pretty hard and dirty work if that's what you want to do. And I just think that's necessary. You won't be able to do it. But I also sort of think that it wouldn't just be economic power, either a diplomatic power. You have to use every instrument of national power. You need a full-bore strategy, I think.
Here's again a two-part question. How often did ethics or ethical values get discussed when you were operating in the field as a CIA operative, and how often are those discussed when you were engaged in policy discussions concerning counterterrorism?
In the field, you don't really have time to talk about that too much. Sometimes you're asked to do things and you just have to sort of rely on your principles as to whether you're going to do it or not, I think. In my early training, there was training in ethics. I don't think, like one of my issues, and the students heard this here today, we haven't had time to talk about it, but the whole issue of enhanced interrogation, which I never participated in any way. In fact, I didn't know about that program until it was disclosed in a Washington Post article in late fall of 2004, long after I was out of Afghanistan, that there were secret prisons and all this sort of stuff going on. But I sort of think that in those kinds of issues, that the government made a mistake because what it did was it went to the lawyers first and it asked what is legal. And so they came up with all these torture definitions of what is torture, basically. And they essentially told the government lawyers, CIA officers in the field, you can do the following things and they're not illegal. That's what they were told. And that was the judgment of the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice, which is the office of the United States government, which tells the executive branch what's legal and what's not legal. That's kind of the whole way this was approached. But I think that was the wrong question to ask. What can we do? Because what happens then is you go right up to the line of what's legally permissible. I think it was the wrong approach. I think the first question should have been a policy question. Do we want to go down this path as a country? And in asking that question, you don't just speak to lawyers. You might have lawyers involved. They give legal opinions. What you need is theologians and philosophers, and you need, practical politicians, and you need historians, and you need people to look at that and sort of say, gosh, didn't we prosecute people, Japanese generals and admirals, for torturing soldiers and prisoners in World War II and waterboarding them? Well, the answer to that is yes, and we executed them. So I think there was a whole slew of issues here that should have been addressed from a policy point of view first, and then you can get to the legal question, sort of say, okay, policy-wise, we think we should do this. Is it legal? And we did it the opposite way, and I think it was wrong.
So part two, when you were involved in the policy discussions back in D.C., how often were ethics or the question, is this the right thing to do, part of the discussion?
It definitely did come up. I can think of particular instances like in the Balkans, in Kosovo. It's an interesting anecdote. When the United States government was deciding with its allies to bomb Serbia because of its aggression against the Albanians in Kosovo, the lawyers in the government sort of realized right away, well, we might be taking prisoners here. What do we do with them? Like, nobody remembered in the US government how the Gulf War was, years before that. All those lawyers were gone, all those people were gone in the government. So we had to sort of discuss, okay, if people are captured, how are they going to be treated? What are the ethics of this? Who should be doing it? And all that kind of stuff. So it would come up quite a lot. But you also have to remember that some of the things that happened to us as a country, like, we didn't ask for 9/11, it happened. And you have to respond to it, like, pretty quickly. So what happens is there's always a catch-up period where the government is trying to figure out what actions do we need to do here. It doesn't happen immediately.
Here's a different approach. You mentioned that we do not criminalize, quote, thought crimes, end quote. Is there a point at which it's appropriate to arrest self-radicalizing Americans prior to them perpetrating or attempting an attack? Is contribution to jihadi Facebook message board websites so dangerous that we cannot leave it go unstopped?
Well, I'm sure there are others here that know those rules better than I do, but you can kind of express what you want to in this country. You can say what you want to. You can think what you want to. You can't incite people to violence. I mean, there's a line there somewhere. I'm not sure what the case law is or what the statutes say, but there is definitely a line there somewhere. And I think one of the tricks now is to sort of, I call it inoculating these communities that are most at risk. And so how do you do that? Because the goal should be like preventing young people from wasting their lives and getting involved in something that, would be self-destructive and destructive to other people. So how do you find that? And one of the problems, I think, in the country is that, when the police get involved in something, even when they're well-meaning, or the FBI, there's a lot of distrust that communities have towards that. Maybe they're more trustful of teachers or social workers or religious leaders or parents or something like that. So, but it's a problem. I mean, if someone is, on the verge, like, of taking some action, like what our leadership most fears, someone with a backpack with some explosives that walks into some elementary school or something like that, whatever it happens to be, a shopping mall, at what point, can you intervene? And I think it's a little bit murky.
Here's a point that you raised earlier, but the person asked, what have we learned from the Boston Marathon bombing? What do we do to minimize the potential harm from lone wolf terror attacks in this country? Can anything be done?
Yeah, well, the lone wolf problem is what I was just talking about. It's a huge problem. I think we learned a fair amount from the Boston Marathon bombings. A couple of things. The system, once it happened, actually responded pretty well in Boston. There were a lot of studies that the government did in terms of how the Boston police responded, how the national authorities responded, how the hospitals responded. It wasn't seamless, but it worked pretty well. There were some criticisms. I wouldn't call them minor, but they weren't massive either. So that was something we learned, that our unity of command in terms of, and unity of effort after a problem like that is better than it used to be. I think that's interesting. It's not so much on a personal basis. I always remark at these sort of instances, these sorts of events, like look at the two brothers involved in the Boston Marathon bombings. And it's just always fascinating to me, like the CNN, the networks will go out and interview the friends of these people. And what's always striking to me is how people say, he's just a normal guy. He went to high school dances, he was captain of the wrestling team. Like, we had no idea he'd be involved in something like this, which kind of to me underscores what a difficult problem this is for law enforcement. Because unless somebody has like a record, a criminal record, is prone to violence, whatever, it's hard to intervene in those things, and you can't, that's why we're so surprised in a way. because you don't often know what's going on in the innermost heart of someone who's plotting something that, could really be a tragedy.
Sort of a final question here. If you had the ear of the governor and the power of the state legislature to enact some sort of changes, reforms here in Minnesota, what actions would you recommend the state be taking to make this state more safe and more secure?
More police? I don't know. No, I think that, I guess a number of things really. I think you have to identify the communities that are most at risk, pour resources into some of that as best you can, and try to do it, not in a heavy-handed government way, but in a more local way and listening to the people in the communities. Some of that will take money, some of it will, require some of that. I think that's something that I definitely do here. I would support organizations that bring the private sector and the government together. We have those, but beef them up maybe. Some of that will take money. One thing about this area is that there's so many successful international corporations headquartered here, and some of them are quite famous really for being leaders in protecting their physical plants around the world and their employees and their forensic capability and so on and so forth. So I would maybe conduct studies, lessons learned from some of that, and figure out how, what you could learn from all of that and how it might improve your security.
So, chance for a final comment. Any final thought you want to leave us with about the future of both the state and the country when it comes to the war on terror?
I think we're doing better. I think in some ways we're safer, but this struggle is going to go on. And we shouldn't be surprised when we hear about different tragedies in different parts of the country, because I think it will happen. Our government has to keep improving at this and at our defenses and our intelligence and so on. But it will happen, and basically, I think we have to just get better at managing our responses. 9/11 was such a shock because it was so massive, because it occurred here on our homeland. Europe had been undergoing terrorism for quite a long while. Israel certainly, and other places. We weren't used to it, but it's just kind of a fact of life now. So I think what we need to do is develop a mentality to not blame a Democratic president or a Republican president or whoever it happens to be, because it's going to happen, and it's going to happen regardless of who's president. Now, there may be mistakes involved. Okay, fine, deal with that. But let's learn in each case what has happened, how we can do things better, and basically move forward.
Let's show our appreciation to Mike Hurley.
Thank you.